Welcome to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield.
Hello, I'm Alex Novarese, a director at Byfield, and our guest on this week's Counsel Culture is David Morley, one of the most high-profile and respected figures that city law has produced. But we're not here primarily to discuss David's 36 years as one of London's top banking lawyers and long-time leader of Allen & Overy. We're focusing on some of his more recent work since stepping down from frontline leadership, notably setting up the consultancy Dejonghe Morley, which advises law firms and investors. And in the short time since its launch last year, it's helped make David one of the leading voices on external investment in the law. David, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for that very kind introduction.
Well, kicking off quickly with first question, you had, as we got in the intro, you had years in the law, a busy portfolio career afterwards. You got up to lots of things. What made you want to dive headlong into setting up this business with Wim and the whole world of law firm investment?
Good question. I think, in a way, I sort of feel like my career, one way or another, has led me to this point. A combination of big law firm leadership experience, then subsequently investment world experience. And I could see, I think when Wim and I were talking over a year ago, we could see that something was changing in the market. There was a sea change in investor interest in the legal sector. And we thought that it was an absolutely fascinating, you could kind of sense the tectonic plates were beginning to shift, grinding very slowly at first, but definitely shifting. And there's many forces at play in the legal sector at the moment. And we thought we might be able to play some small part in that. And, I think we both believe that the law doesn't have a God-given right to exist, that law firms do not have a God-given right to exist in the way that they're structured at the moment. They have to earn it, and they have to move with the times. And we think that that's something that we can help with.
What were some of those forces that you saw driving a shift, a change in the dynamics?
So the first thing, I think, the most important thing is this drive to consolidation in the sector. This is not unique to the law. This is happening across all professional services, and there's many reasons for it. But you can point to the need for more scale in order to attract the quality of talent that you need to compete these days. Not just legal talent as well, technology talent, and the need for scale to invest in technology and, again, hire the right people to drive you forward with that. And the costs of operating a business like a law firm have just gone through the roof. It's very, very tough to operate a law firm at a small law firm these days, because you have a lot of the costs without many of the benefits. And all of those factors. Then you've got the global forces at play. I think, you can see the transatlantic mergers that are happening. Everybody can see the influx of US firms into London. I think 2.5 years ago, a firm like Paul Weiss, that everybody knows, had no lawyers in London whatsoever. They now have over 250.
So you've given a clue of why you think it's going to be a big trend. Why do you think people feel so strongly about it in the legal industry? Does it just touch on those sort of notions of professional independence or what it means to be a lawyer?
Yeah, it kind of does go to the core. I mean, I think people feel it goes to the core of what it means to be professional. But there's a lot of other forces at play there. I think, let's be honest, the legal profession is pretty conservative. Not that much has changed. The scale has changed over the last 40, 50 years. If you go back 40, 50 years ago, there were very few law firms in the world, if any, that had more than half a dozen partners. It was a really, really small profession. And that, in terms of the way it was structured, every town had its own small law firm. Even when I joined A&O in 1980, that's how old I am. I was one of 12 trainees that joined the firm. It was 100 lawyers in one office in London in those days when I joined. And look at it now. And I went back when I was senior partner and looked at the accounts for that year that I joined, 1980, it were revenues of £7 million.
7 million, wow.
£7 million, 100 lawyers in one office in London. So, it changed a lot. But these, over the course of one lifetime, it changed a lot. But the profession generally is pretty conservative. And I remember a partner once saying to me, well, we should be conservative because we're like a nuclear, it's like a nuclear power station. You don't want to be, we're having a debate about innovation. And this partner was arguing, why do we want to be innovative? Because, you're running a nuclear power station. The last thing you want to do is start experimenting with things. And I think that's quite a common perspective that, it's a sort of feeling that people have that we should be conservative. That's our job. We're to manage risk and so on. And I get all that, but we're also, and I don't think there's any contradiction in this. We're also, law firms are also businesses and they live or die in the market. And in order to succeed in the market, you have to innovate. You have to try new things. You have to be able to move with the market and what your clients need. And what clients need now is not what they needed 50 years ago. It's completely different. So I get that people feel sensitive about this. They feel maybe for some people it can feel a bit intrusive that you've got people who are not lawyers. In fact, and I think that's a common thought. I mean, I think we're the only profession that refers to highly skilled people who are working as part of our businesses, but are not qualified in the same way as we are. We refer to them as non-lawyers. I don't think architects, for example, refer to non-architects, or or even accountants refer to non-accountants. They just don't. It's just that, but we do, and I think that reflects a kind of a mindset. Somehow, yeah, and I'm just observing it rather than I'm not criticizing it, but I think it can hold the profession back because, and particularly now, as we look to the future, there's no doubt in my mind that the winners in the future, the most successful law firms, will not only have the best lawyers, they'll also have the best technologists working with them. And you have to think about how you're going to manage that relationship when historically, honestly, people who are not lawyers in many, many law firms are regarded as second-class citizens. I think that's changed. It has changed a lot in a lot of firms, but that historically was the way it was. And so, when you add up all those attitudes, it's not surprising then when something comes along that feels new, potentially threatening, but, because lawyers always tend to look on the downside, they tend to be less good at seeing the opportunity, then that's not surprising that you get a negative reaction. I mean, that's true of most new things in the profession. But, on the other hand, lawyers typically, I exclude myself from this, pretty smart people, and they are quick learners. And when it becomes obvious that something's a good idea, they'll be on it like a flash.
Fair point. So you're out in the market, you're talking to investors and law firms all the time about external investment. What kind of deals you can't give away trade secrets, but what kind of deals are you expecting over the next 12 to 18 months? What the sort of genre of it, the kind of firms that, broadly how it's structured. What are you thinking?
I'll put it into context a little bit, because I think sometimes now I'm hearing people say, well, there's not many deals, are there? Is this really happening? It's all a bit of hype and there's nothing really going on and so on, which I think is a misunderstanding of how these kinds of markets operate. If you look at accountancy, for example, I know it's not the same as law, but it's adjacent to law. Private capital started coming into accountancy around about 12 years ago, both in Europe, the UK, and in the US. Even 5 years ago, there wasn't a single top 30 accountancy firm in the US that had taken private capital. Now, more than 30% of the top 30 accountancy firms in the US have taken private capital. So So in 5 years, it went from, and a lot of those firms went on record as saying, we'll never take private capital. We've been in, it's quite interesting to read the stories because there's a direct read across to what you hear from law firms, because people say, we've been in existence for 100 years. We've never needed external capital. There's absolutely no reason for us to change anything. And then 3 years later, they've changed everything. So there's we're in from a legal point of view, it could be faster because I think private capital has a playbook for how to invest in professional services, but it could be slower because of the profession is more conservative, and it's more bound by regulation. So the restrictions on taking external investment, which exists in most of Europe and most of the US, are going to slow things down. I don't think they're going to stop it. We can talk about that later, but they will slow things down. So I think, when you compare it with accountancy, we're probably in year 3 of that cycle, if it were to follow a similar trend. I think you're going to continue to see smaller firms gradually being rolled up and consolidated onto platforms. That's kind of less of a play than it was a few years ago. We can talk about why that is. It's
I want to get your views on that specifically. Consolidator model, which gets more cynicism these days, doesn't it? In terms of
it does, and I think rightly so, actually. And but it's more cynicism both in the legal world, but also more importantly, investors. And there's good reasons for that, I think. So, but I think you'll still see a steady stream of that. It makes sense for smaller firms, and the smaller firms greet these approaches from private capital with open arms. It's really interesting to see that, because they see it as a solution to many of the headaches that they have in running their business. It's not the same for larger firms, and I think it will take longer for larger firms to get on board, not least because, when you've got 50 or more stakeholders, 40, 50 partners or more, that's a lot of people you've got to persuade, and it takes time. That doesn't happen overnight. So, but I think you will see a steady trickle of deals. You'll probably see a deal, very shortly, maybe, which I think could well be, make people set up and take notice. A larger firm going down that road. And I think some people. Somebody repeated a rumor that I've heard to me yesterday that I've heard probably 30 or 40 times in the last few months, that there could be up to 2 AmLaw 20 firms in the US who are going to go down this road. I don't know if that's true or not, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was at least one. Because I think
talking about a kind of MSO structured deal where it's kind of money.
Well, if it's in the States, it almost certainly has to be an MSO structure. It's the only way you can effectively do a deal and stay in compliance with the rules that restrict profit sharing and external investment in the US in most states. So it would almost have to be an MSO. And the MSO deals are already being done in the States. There's a steady stream of those, mainly in the personal injury space at the moment. And larger firms are looking at them. There was an article in the FT a few weeks ago about Morgan & Morgan, which is the biggest, most well-known personal injury firm in the US. Clearly, they're contemplating this. It makes sense from their point of view, to build a national brand, for example, and that's something that is also relevant in the UK. Now, this is not necessarily, I think at this point, big lawyers are thinking, well, why is this relevant to me? Because this is how it starts, and this is how, there's a building up from the market. It doesn't start with external investment in the largest law firms in the world. It starts with the smaller ones, the bigger ones, and their particular strategies. And over time, as they are proved to work, more investors are attracted to the business. Maybe some longer term, more institutional capital becomes attracted to the business as it becomes more obvious that there's an investment success story there. But in personal injury is a very good example. It's, think about it in the UK. There's no national brand for, if you're hurt at work or you have a car accident and whatever, who do you immediately think of as a firm you would go to get legal advice? Most people draw a blank. I mean, it just doesn't exist. Same with family law, same with conveyancing, same with it's really weird if you think about it, that these national brands have not built up consumer facing national brands. And I think
merging on there, and some of those have either taken private capital or they've gotten close.
They have. And private capital has seen that opportunity, sees that as an opportunity to build up instead of, and again, it comes back to this consolidation point, because there's lots of firms that play in those spaces, but it's very, very fragmented. There's over 9,000 law firms in the UK. Do we need 9,000 law firms in the UK?
Possibly not. So look, really quickly, I don't want to get too bogged down in it, but you mentioned the regional consolidator model, and that's definitely had more criticism this year in terms of, lowish margin businesses that aren't really growing. You think some of that criticism is valid of at least some of those deals, or you can see that the rationale is not necessarily as strong as it could be?
I think until a year or so ago, it was a popular kind of playbook in the investment community for smaller investors to buy up a series of businesses. This has happened across every other professional services sector. Accountancy is probably the most relevant example, but it's been true of vets, it's been true of architects, it's been true, you name it. And the idea was that you would buy a series of small businesses for a multiple of, let's say, 6 or 7 times their earnings. You would consolidate that into a larger, so you buy, let's say, 10 firms of 10 million revenue each. Now you've got one firm, in theory, of 100 million, and you have a whole new range of investors who are willing, who want to look at that because it's big enough for them to write a big check, which is, they all have minimum size checks that they can write. And magically overnight, just by dint of change of scale, you can sell that larger one for maybe a multiple of 12 times earnings. So it's like an alchemy. It was an alchemy. But then people began to realize, I think investors began to realize, there was a few high profile examples didn't go so well. And they began to realize that actually you haven't really bought one firm, you've bought 10 firms that haven't been properly integrated. And that's, and there's a lot of heavy lifting you need to do to integrate that. So it's kind of gone out of fashion, not just in the legal sector, but across the whole investment sector, because larger, more sophisticated investors are saying, this doesn't, what are we buying here? I mean, if we're just buying 10 separate businesses, which have no common pricing policy, no common HR, no common, it's like, where's the synergy? How do you benefit from being bigger? It's just a ragbag collection of firms. And so the market has shifted towards favouring more integrated models. You see this in the advertising agency business, the same thing, communications, consultancies and things like that. It's exactly the same. And I think it makes sense because, for example, when we at A&O, whenever we did a merger or we consolidated, it was different because we were already one firm. But we always insisted that anyone who joined us, we had one common IT platform throughout the entire firm, one common finance system throughout the entire firm, uniform reporting and so on, not a whole kind of different one for each individual constituent part, because it's really hard to get people to work together.
So we touched on some deals that maybe don't work so well. I'd be curious to get your view. What's a great deal for outside investment? What's the sort of deal where you think, oh, this has got the component of it's going to do fantastically for the investors, the law firm's really going to benefit from it? I mean, remember once we talked recently, you said that growth is, when there's very clear growth plans, that can often make the case just so much more compelling for both sides. I wonder if I could get a few thoughts from you on that. What's a good deal?
So I think the best deals are where you get a law firm in this case, a law firm leadership who have a clear strategy, a clear sense of ambition about what they want to achieve and where they want to take their firm. Typically a big ambition, not exaggerated ambition, but a big ambition. And they get together with a like-minded investment partner who buys into what they're doing, may help improve it and challenge it and push it. And, out of that process comes something even better. And is culturally aligned with, and tied into the firm in terms of not just the strategy, but also the timeline, over what period is this going to happen? What do we need to do? What are the key steps? What is the money going to be used for? How? And to be really clear about all of that. And it should be the law firm's plan, not the investor's plan. And for larger firms, I think that's absolutely key. And I think it may well be that for larger firms, the best option is going to be minority investment, where they remain, because for the reasons we were talking about at the very beginning, it's emotional. I mean, the partners don't want to give up control. Very understandable. And so maybe there's a halfway house where you can get all the benefits of external investment, which is not just the money. Actually, the money is an important part of it, but what's more important is, I think, the business expertise, the network, the people, the discipline, the sort of focus on performance that comes with the best investors in the best deals. And those are the best. Those are where the law firm has a plan and they have a strategy. It will get refined and improved in the process of discussion with the investor. But what they're really doing is accelerating the pace of that plan. That, to me, is going to be the most successful ones. The ones that will not be successful are people who drift into it, who think it's a way to make a quick buck, who are most focused on the price up front and, how much they get out of it on day one and so on. That's unlikely to succeed. And actually, most investors know that. So it's quite tough to get a deal away like that.
Yeah. So when you're talking to partners, to law firm leaders, what do you tell them about the biggest challenge of taking outside investment? Is that to do with governance? Is it cultural? Is it just getting an ethos thing? What do you encounter?
It's all of that. I think generally we say we've had a lot of approaches from law firms who've said, "Oh, tell us about, we're thinking about private capital. What should we do? How should we think about this or whatever?" And our first thing is, well, what discussions have you had with your partners? So, and normally the answer is none, because normally it's like, the managing partner.
One, isn't it?
Yeah, normally the managing partner and the senior partner. Well, we had a breakfast session a few months ago with 20 leaders of mid-sized law firms, and I said, my first question was, how many of you had approaches from private capital investors, serious approaches? Every hand went up, which I knew would be the answer. And then my next question was, how many of you have discussed those approaches, not necessarily in the context of, oh, we're going to do a deal, but in the context of, this is interesting, this is something that's going on in the market, how do we react to this, how should we think about this with your board? 17 out of 20 hands went up, so that made sense. Then the next question was, how many of you discussed this or even raised the topic of private capital investment with your partners? 3 hands went up. It's actually very understandable that's the case. The reasons given for that ranged from, oh, well, I don't want to have to start a discussion with my partners until I know myself the answers. I don't look an idiot, sort of raising something I don't know the answers to myself. Others, well, I don't want to set hairs running, which is completely understandable. And others were, there's no point in talking to my partners until we've got a complete plan. So, I would say the sooner you start a discussion with your partners, the better. Even if you've never got any intention of going down that road, which is where most people start in their thinking, it makes sense to be having a discussion with your partners about what is happening in the market, what is changing, what the options are, and so on. You don't need to commit to anything. You don't need a plan. You don't need to have all the answers. There's ways of doing that, I think, which help prepare the partnership for what's coming next, whether it's external investment or it's not, because that's a deliberate choice in itself. That's a strategic choice. I'm not going to take external investment. Fine. What are the consequences of that? How does that flow through? That might be the right answer for many law firms, but not discussing that with your partners and the reasons for it seems to me to be missing trick.
All right. Well, let's step back a little bit. You left frontline law firm management in a decade ago, basically. So as we look at the profession now, big picture, 2026, these are broader observations as a industry watcher. What stands out to you? Are you surprised by how it's evolved, or are these forces, are these things that were long in play?
I wouldn't say I am surprised. When I started at A&O, one of my first lessons from a partner who told me that an Alan Novarese lawyer is never surprised. and, and at the time, I'm not sure I fully understood it, but now I look back and I know what he meant by that. So I'm not surprised in the sense that a lot of what he's playing out has been pretty obvious if you looked hard enough for 20, 30 years. So for example, the advance of US firms into London, that is hardly a surprise. Yeah. The consolidation of the sector, I think you'd have to have been hiding under a rock for 20 years not to have seen that coming in some shape or force. And a lot of these forces, it's interesting. I like the phrase of there's an American economist, I can't remember his name now, but he coined the phrase inevitable surprise. And I think, I think that's a good way of thinking about it, because actually a lot of these surprises, what seemed like a surprise, have been a long time coming. And if you looked hard enough, you could see the pattern. You could have a pretty good guess at the way it was going to pan out. You don't know the exact detail or the exact route, but these big forces at play, the globalization of the industry, the consolidation of the industry, the influence of the US on the industry, these have all been pretty clear for decades. What you don't know is how fast. And change in the profession, it's more general, but it typically in the legal sector, it's gradually, then suddenly. It feels like nothing's happening, and then suddenly it all happens at once. A good example was when back in my A&O days, when we opened up in Australia, which for years everybody had said, no international firm's ever going to go to Australia. It's too small. The market's too well defended by the locals. It makes no sense and whatever. Then we did it. Within a year, 3 of the big Australian firms had also jumped into a merger, which everybody had said for decades would never, ever happen. And then it happened. So that's just the way these things work. And I think the same will be true of private capital. There would be a lot of skeptics, a lot of cynics, a lot of people who think it's all hype and so on. And to a certain extent, right now they're right, but over the longer term, the medium term, it's inevitable, I think.
Okay. All right, David. Well, thanks for your time and thoughts. Final question. I can't resist. The profession over the next 5 to 10 years, what are your big predictions? Apart from lots more private investment and capital and all that stuff,
I think at the top of the profession, and I'm going to sort of nail my colours to the mast here. I think over that kind of time period, you're going to see pretty major structural change. I think the partnership model, which has served the profession well for so many years, hundreds of years, is under tremendous strain. And I think and it's going to have to adapt and modify. And so I think there will be a significant structural change. The problem that I see with the partnership model, this is particularly acute at the top of the profession, perhaps less so in the middle of the profession, is a misalignment between the interests of the very best lawyers in the business and the long-term interests of the firm itself. and it's a feature of the partnership model because it's a full distribution model, naked in, naked
mobile
out.
stock you're talking about. And,
the sort of what I call the free agency war, where lawyers are free agents, and under the partnership model, there's almost no financial incentive for them to stay, and there's very few penalties for leaving, and that's putting tremendous strain at the top level. You don't see it at the moment because the firms are still doing very well, but it's causing real stress at the top level because it's rational for partners to jump ship to another firm. I call it keeping frogs in the wheelbarrow. How do you keep the frogs in the wheelbarrow? And it's rational for a partner to hop from one firm to another for higher share of the profits. And in the past, that was very much constrained by shared background, shared education, cultural strength of your culture, and so on. That's losing its grip as under pressure from market forces. And I think the firms are going to have to respond to that. And aligning the interests of your partners in the long-term future growth and success of the firm is going to be a key driver, as opposed to a fixation with this year's profits, which is kind of where we are as a profession at the moment, and drives some pretty unattractive behaviour.
Full distribution, it's kind of got to go, isn't it? Really, it's a real
and I think that's one reason is the talent. But another reason is that in the future, over the next 10, 15 years, you will need to invest significant money in technology. Particularly in AI, not just buying licenses from Harvey and so on, although that's going to be, because that's going to be table stakes. If you don't have that, you can't even play. But in really building something, serious technology, you're going to have to invest for the future. And the partnership model is just completely unideal for that. And so I think there will be, I think there's some inevitable surprises there. You can see the structural strains, and they will only get worse, I think. And eventually, people will figure out that they need to do something different. And the profession being what it is, once one big player goes, they'll all follow.
Okay. Inevitable surprise feels like a reasonable point to draw. It's been a pleasure as always. David, thank you for your time. This has been the latest episode of Counsel Culture. Tune in for the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.